Should we start or we wait for a couple of minutes?
I think you can start in maybe a minute, if that works for you, Dr. Mu'taz.
Okay, I'll wait for 1 minute, then we will start. Okay. Hi, this is Mu'taz Al-Mahdi, senior partner at Shalakany, and I have also with me my partner Mariam Fahmi. Hi, Mariam.
Hi, doctor.
And my senior partner Adam Shalakany. Hi, Adam.
Hi, doctor. Hi, everybody.
First, we hope that you all and your families are doing well and safe. And we trust that together we will bypass these hard moments soon, God willing. We thank you for accepting our invitation and attending this webinar, the main purpose of which is obviously to touch base and discuss the most important consequences and legal issues raised by the COVID-19 pandemic. Our webinar agenda for the coming 45 minutes shall be as follows. I'll start by briefly recapping the most important decisions and measures taken during the past few days. Then my partners, Mariam and Adam, will briefly focus on two main issues that are top of mind of our clients, which are the employment issues and the force majeure event, together with any potential disputes. Finally, and given the considerable number of attendees, Please feel free to write down your questions throughout the webinar, and we will be happy to briefly answer same if possible during the last 15 minutes. You can use the Q&A button for that purpose. Well, I understand that most of you are closely monitoring the situation. However, let's refresh our memory and recap the most important decisions and measures taken by the Egyptian government and the competent authorities to control the spread of the COVID-19 in Egypt and decrease its effects on the Egyptian economy. The CBE, the Central Bank of Egypt, has taken a series of decisions and measures to mitigate the negative effects of the current circumstances on the Egyptian economy, such as suspending the loans collection for 6 months without penalties, postponing interest payment for 6 months as well, extending payment deadlines for credit cards, personal cars loans, and real estate loans for another period of 6 months, suspending the charges, fees, and commissions on transfers between local banks for 3 months, and deposit rate fell from 12.25% to 9.25%. The lending rate is now 10.25%, and the main operation and discount rates are both at 9.75%. As for taxes, the government took the following measures. A 3-month real estate tax postponement has been granted to companies operating in the industrial and tourism sectors with the permission to repay existing real estate tax liabilities in monthly installments over the next 6 months. Administrative seizures for tax debts shall be released subject to the payment of 10% of the due taxes, and any ongoing dispute shall be settled through the competent dispute resolution committees. The government has also decreased the applicable stamp tax duty for transfers of shares to be 0.125% for non-residents and 0.05% for residents. Taxes on dividends distribution have been decreased by half to become 5% instead of 10%. Finally, non-residents have been exempt from capital gains taxes applicable to transfers of shares. As for residents, the application of this tax has been postponed to January 1st, 2022. On a different note, the number of public officers working at governmental authorities have been reduced, and I believe my partner Mariam will definitely further elaborate on this matter after a while. The government also offered a market incentive package consisting of the following: the allocation of 1 billion Egyptian pound to be paid to exporters as part of their overdue subsidies during the month of March and April, the allocation of 50 billion Egyptian pounds for real estate finance, and another 50 billion Egyptian pounds for the tourism sector to provide a sort of stability to the hotel's operations. Speaking of tourism, you may be aware that domestic tourism has been suspended to Luxor, Aswan, South Sinai, and Red Sea governorates. Further, all employees working in the tourism sector, particularly in hotels and restaurants in the said 4 destinations, shall be subject to quarantine for 14 days. We also noted, regretfully, during the past week, the total closure of a number of hotels in Egypt. NUCA, the New Urban Communities Agency, decided to suspend all previously announced auctions and tenders for all new cities until further notice. And the FRA, or the Financial Regulatory Authority, extended the deadline for listed companies to submit their Q4 2019 and Q1 2020 financial statements until 30 April and 15 June 2020, respectively. The FRA has also extended the deadlines for payment of insurance premia for life, medical, and car insurance policies for individuals, as well as collective life and property insurance policies for companies. The FRA has also approved an EGX proposal to submit or to suspend circuit breakers and allowing their contribution only in the case the market fall by 5%. The Ministry of Oil has set up an online platform for foreign companies to make bids for the gold exploration tender in the Eastern Deserts. And finally, I believe we are all aware that in less than 3 hours from now, and precisely at 7 p.m., we will commence the imposed curfew till 6 a.m. tomorrow morning for a period of 2 weeks. And it should be noted that any violation of the curfew restrictions shall be penalized according to the emergency law with a fine starting at 4,000 Egyptian pounds and or imprisonment. That's all for today. Please stay tuned for further updates and our daily reporting on pages, on Shalakany pages, on LinkedIn and the Facebook. And now I'll pass the mic to Mariam to share with us her valuable opinion regarding the employment issues. Please go ahead, Mariam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moataz. And hi, everyone. Many thanks for making yourselves available for this webinar. I will, brief you quickly on the latest developments on employment matters and try to touch base on some hot topics at the moment. I'm sure you all have so many questions and specific cases that you would like to discuss. So as Dr. Moataz was saying, the government and the Prime Minister issued a number of decisions over the past period, and there were some decisions that relating to employment matters. However, all of the decisions are only relating to governmental and public sector employees, so none of which are binding or applicable on private sector. However, a week ago, the Minister of Manpower met with representatives of employers from the private sector and a representative from the Federation of Trade Unions and discussed the applicability of the Prime Minister decree regulating employment matters in the government sector to the private sector. In this meeting, they decided that the decree will not be binding on the private sector. However, the representatives of private sector employers must come up with a plan relating to employment matters in the private sector to be submitted to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. However, until now, this plan has not been presented. So let me take you through the Prime Minister decree that is regulating employment issues in the government and public sector, because most of private sector employers are starting to implement some of these regulations already. So in this decree, the employees who can work remotely should work from home. This, of course, depends on the nature of the work and whether it can be done remotely or not. And for other employees who cannot work from home due to the nature of the work, they should work on a shift basis, whether daily or weekly. Also, according to this decree, some categories of employees have been granted an exceptional leave. So employees with chronic diseases have been granted exceptional leave. Female employees who are pregnant or mothers of children of an age of 12 years or less, and female employees of children with disability have been granted exceptional leave. So this exceptional leave is a leave for 15 days that is fully paid and will not be deducted from the employee's annual leave balance. Also, this decree, said that employers must make sure that the health and safety regulations and measures instructed by the WHO should be implemented in the workplace. And the Minister of Manpower said yesterday that these regulations should also be undertaken in private sector companies. So you have to make sure that all preventive and precautionary measures mandated by the government and the WHO are implemented in the workplace, whether it's an administrative office or a plant or a site. So these are the main developments in relation to employment matters. I will try to tackle and address a few issues that we have seen and we've been asked to opine on over the past week or two. So I will be starting with the annual leave and whether the employer can oblige employees to take time off and whether this time off should be deducted from the employee's annual leave balance or not. So according to the labor law, employers has the right to oblige employees to take their annual leaves during a specified period. And this period is determined by the employers based on the work requirements and circumstances. So we are of the view that employers at this stage can actually tell the employees and encourage them to use their annual leave balance. Another question we get asked a lot is whether the employer can oblige employees to take time off from work, which is not paid. Well, the answer to this question is that no, the employer cannot oblige employers to stay at home and not get paid because up until now, there are no binding legislation that allows the employer to do this. However, the labor law actually tackles a situation where there is exceptional circumstances or force majeure situation. And in this case, if the employee cannot undertake or perform their work because of exceptional circumstances or force majeure cases that are not because of reasons related to the employer, then the employer can deduct the salary by only half. So the employer can give them half their salary, but the employer cannot, decide this on its own. So if, for example, an employer decides to shut down a plant, can an employer do this? Well, no. But if the authorities, tells the employer to shut down a plant, then the employer can reduce the salary to half pay. Also, a very related question we get a lot. Can the employer reduce the working hours? Yes, but can the employer reduce the working hours and as a result of this, reduce salaries? Well, no, because in an employment contract, there is already an agreed upon salary. And the employer cannot unilaterally decide to reduce working hours and as a result reduce salary. So I think these are the main questions we get a lot. I'm sure you would have a lot of questions in the Q&A section, so we're waiting for your questions. And now I can leave the floor to Adam.
Hi, thank you, Mariam. All right, so I'll be speaking for the next 5 to 10 minutes about, I think, something that's on the top of everybody's mind. We've definitely been getting a lot of questions about it. It's force majeure here in Egypt. So I will start with a caveat, which is, I think, every lawyer always starts that way. We're going to now explain the general rules for force majeure and a separate issue called unforeseen circumstances as regulated by the Egyptian Civil Code. But, and this is the caveat, Usually governments, after these types of crises, they come up with later legislation and decisions that might overrule the general conditions of the civil code. For instance, labor, construction, usually when there's a crisis, sometimes they issue regulations or decrees that say that for construction, this period is exempted or that period is exempted, etc. for labor. Okay, so the force majeure is regulated by the Egyptian Civil Code. There's also another concept that you need to know, which is called unforeseen events. And these are two different concepts. And I think it's quite important to understand that they're not the same. There is a suspicion by most clients now that this is a force majeure event, but we'll take you now through the separate conditions required in order to establish force majeure. This is an exceptional legal principle, and it's generally very narrowly interpreted, and courts and judges are reticent or to apply it. There needs to be a very severe situation that fulfills the 4 criteria that we'll discuss right now. So the first criteria is that it has to be something that is unforeseeable. Unforeseeable basically means that the event itself could not have been foreseen by the parties entering into a contract, because we're generally talking about contractual relationships here. You know, we would say generally, yes, the pandemic that we're in currently was probably unforeseeable. Then you have the next condition is it must be irresistible. So neither the parties can resist or avoid the occurrence of the event. And then you have 3, external, which means that the parties played no part in the occurrence of the event. And I think that's clear that this is also, you know, this condition is met here. But the most important condition that needs to be met is the 4th one, which is that the performance must be impossible. Now, this is the main question that's going to be on everyone's mind going forward, whether or not we have force majeure. It's whether or not the obligation that needs to be performed is impossible. Now, there is a very big difference under the law between impossibility and burdensome. So this other concept we'll discuss in a bit called unforeseen circumstances, that deals with overly burdensome obligations. But impossibility can be either physical or legal. For instance, if I'm supposed to build a house on a piece of land, and then there's a tsunami or there's an earthquake and that land is now gone, that's physically impossible, okay? So there's been force majeure here. And I am no longer obligated to perform my obligation of building the house. Now, legal impossibility is similar. If I come and I'm about to build a house and the government says, actually, no more houses can be built in Egypt ever. Then that would be legal impossibility. It's still impossible, but through a legal nature. I think it's very important to note that this legal impossibility needs to be truly legal, in the sense that it has to come by decree, or better yet, a law. We have a lot of statements now by the government which are not decrees or laws. So you need to be quite certain that the impossibility is coming from an actual legal impossibility. Now, the impossibility can't also be general, in the sense that, it has to be as to the obligation itself. So for instance, right now there is a military, there's a curfew, a nighttime curfew, which may make obligations at night impossible, but if the obligation is still performed, you can still perform it during the day, then it's not really impossible, is it? If you can shift your performance from the night to the day, you can actually still perform your contract, unless the contract is specific that it needs to be done at night, and then there would be an impossibility, in our opinion. So it's quite narrow. A lot of what we think will be force majeure will not be force majeure. It will actually fall into the second bucket, which is unforeseen circumstances. Now, the conditions for unforeseen circumstances are quite similar. So it has to be general, external, unforeseeable event, but instead of making performance impossible, it makes performance onerous or overly burdensome. That's most of the cases that we're going to find over the coming days, that most companies and clients will be able to perform many of their obligations, but it will be overly burdensome. Now, what's the difference? under force majeure, you are exempted from performance. So that means that if you have an obligation and there is an actual force majeure event that has fulfilled the 4 criteria required, you can not perform. You don't have to perform your obligation at all. And for the period of time that the obligation is, that the force majeure is ongoing, you are exempted. Now, if it's a contract that is over time, once the force majeure event is over, your obligations resume. If it's a contract that is very specific and that cannot be performed but in the force majeure period, then your obligations to perform are gone, and both parties are released from that obligation. So it's not a thing for the entire contract, it's for the obligations and corresponding obligations. What does that mean? It means you're exempted from performance. The difference with onerous or unforeseen circumstances is that unforeseen circumstances requires you to continue performing, but you're able then to ask for compensation. And the compensation is to bring the parties back into economic equilibrium. Okay? Economic equilibrium doesn't mean that you're going to be making a profit. It just means that all the excessive losses you've been making will be somehow balanced between the parties, and this will be what the judge does. That's what I've had, what I have to say about force majeure and unforeseen circumstances. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Adam, thank you very much, Adam and Mariam. I believe we have a couple of questions here from Mr. Ahmed Saeed. He is asking, the government didn't stop construction works, so if a company stopped working, will this stop duration will be added to the project schedule or not? I believe, Adam, you can answer this question.
So, okay, so for force majeure, unless it's impossible for you to perform, it must be that it is impossible for you to perform your obligations. Without a government decision or decree stopping construction works, our opinion is that no, it's not impossible. As of yet, obviously things are changing every day. It would still fall into the unforeseen circumstances bucket.
Okay. Another question. What if the contract is silent on force majeure?
Excellent question. I was supposed to address it at the very beginning. So force majeure and unforeseen circumstances are part of the law, and they're part of the civil code, and they are above the contract. So even if you have, so if it's silent, if the contract is silent on force majeure, then you have the regular conditions and provisions of the civil code, and you always have access to them. Now, the question that is more difficult is, what if you have contractual provisions which contradict the civil code or the general rules of force majeure? Our answer to that is no. Unfortunately, the law always trumps the contract. So this is public policy, and you cannot contract yourself out of it.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Till receiving another new question, I personally have a question to your good self concerning the lease contracts of commercial shops and concessions in hotels, particularly when it comes to the lessee is failing to pay the rental. Can the lessee suspend payments, or can the lessee ask for a discount or a reduction on the rental or not? Thanks.
I think excellent question. We've been discussing it internally. The answer, unfortunately, is that force majeure must apply to the obligation itself becoming impossible. Now, here, the payment of rent is not impossible. Banks are still working. You're still able to transfer your rental amounts. And legal possession of the rented premises is still possible. So it's not impossible. So unfortunately, the answer is most likely there's no force majeure, and you must continue performing. Now, there is most likely unforeseen circumstances, and that's a different situation where you would need to bring back the economic equilibrium of the contract.
Of course, unless the parties agreed mutually to change or amend the rent.
Of course.
I think the coming question would be addressed to Mariam. What if a worker comes to work and is displaying symptoms? Can the employer ask the worker to go home? How is this treated in terms of sick days?
Yes, well, if an employee is displaying symptoms, of course, the employer has the right to send him home. And also the employer may be very well in a position to tell that employee to self-isolate for 14 days. As for, in terms of sick, I think you're asking about the sick leave payment. Well, until you're definitely positive that this employee has been tested positive for coronavirus, you will treat those sick days in accordance with the social insurance law and pay him his salary in accordance with the social insurance law.
Okay, thanks, Mari. Going back to the force majeure, a question from Mr. Ahmed Saeed again, but the part of force majeure in the civil code is not a mandatory article. Accordingly, as I understand, what in the contract will prevail the law. Is this correct or no? Adam?
So our understanding is that the force majeure articles will trump the contract provisions. So the civil code will trump.
Okay. Another question, who will govern or take the decision that the event is force majeure or exceptional circumstances?
So that's a very difficult question. So, if you have, this is where you need a legal opinion. You need to make the decision yourself as the creditor or debtor, whether or not it's impossible to perform. Again, it has to be physically or legally impossible. It can't just be burdensome. And you won't find out until after, usually, until, the other party takes you to court and says, actually, it was possible, or, you could have done this or that. So that's the answer.
Thanks, Adam. Any more questions? I'll wait for a half a minute, then we have a question here. Going back to the force majeure again.
So the force majeure is, like I said, top of mind. Dr. Moataz, you want to maybe choose which question?
Yes, if a force majeure occurs and the contract has governmental force majeure or an epidemic force majeure, can either party choose which force majeure to bring if the contract is silent on this?
Okay, so that's a good question. I think I understand now the previous question a bit more as well. So the conditions for force majeure under the law are, they give you the conditions. Now, sometimes parties can expand, right? So they can say if these other events occur, this would also be considered force majeure. And that will depend on the contract, right? But your basic minimum rights are those that are in the civil code. So you wouldn't be able to say if, these things happen, you cannot claim force majeure. But you can expand and say, well, actually, if any of these things happen, they would also be considered force majeure, because that's a contractual, expansion of obligations. And
okay.
The answer, this would depend on the contract. So I couldn't, you wouldn't be able to answer it until you see the actual contract itself.
Okay. We have another question from Ms. Dua Kandil. In relation to the food industry and manufacturing, there was a decree issued today in relation to the employees, whereby it was stated that work will proceed as normal, i.e. 3 8-hour shifts. How do we work around the curfew? Mariam? Take your time to read the question again, please.
Yes, Dr. Moataz. Okay, I haven't actually got the chance to look at this decree today. However, I mean, we have a curfew, and it should be implemented rigidly in accordance with the message of the cabinet. So maybe this would lead to factories and plants working on a 3-day shift, on a 3 shifts per day, to work based on 2 shifts only.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another question regarding the vacation. The employer can force the employee to take time off, not paid, even if the performance of work is possible?
I don't really get the question, but the employer cannot force the employee to take time off not paid, definitely. The employer can encourage employees to take time off and deduct those days from the annual leave balance and not from the salary.
Okay. Okay. Adam, the civil law stated explicitly that in case any of the obligations became burdensome to the parties, the court can grant the equilibrium, so whether it's unforeseen circumstances or force majeure, the reduction or the relief will occur. Dr. Mina Iskander, thanks for your question, Dr. Mina.
Thank you. So our understanding is that when there's force majeure, you are actually exempted from performance, and that is the relief sought. You don't need to perform, okay? Whereas if you are in simply unforeseen circumstances, you must continue performing, and then you can be compensated for that overly burdensome performance, which would include bringing back the parties to equilibrium.
Okay. Is Article 658 in the Egyptian Civil Code covering the lump sum contracts only? What's the case in the remeasured contracts?
I suspect that's for me. I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that now. I'd have to go back and take a look at that article.
Sure. Mariam, there is an addition from Mrs. Dua Kandil stating that the food industry was excluded in the decree.
Yes, doctor. So if you're referring to the curfew decree, I will have to go back to this, but what I understood from the decree, and maybe Dr. Mu'taz or Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, is that only the takeout or delivery restaurants that are excluded from this decree, not factories. So if you could allow me, Ms. Dua, I have to double check this and check today's decree, and then we can get back to you on this.
Perfect.
So some questions on the chat.
Yes, Adam, we have a question on force majeure from Mr. Majid. You've seen it?
I can answer it. So the question is, due to the situation, force majeure, exceptional situation, a party to a contract is impacted, for instance, due to the logistics restrictions. Is there a legal mechanism to reconsider the commercial considerations, i.e. prices? The answer is yes. That's the unforeseen circumstances. That is where the prices would be brought back into equilibrium. Now, again, it's not where you get all your profit. It's really to minimize the losses on both parties. So you bring it back to the equilibrium.
Okay, I believe that we have no further questions. And don't mention Mr. Magid. I think that's okay for today. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Mariam. And thanks for all our attendees. And please, we will keep you posted of our coming webinar. We are intending to hold this sorts of webinars regularly, maybe every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and we will keep you posted definitely. And finally, I wish you to be safe, stay home, and stay safe. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.